I used to think the worst thing family could do was walk away. But no, they used my name to claim orphan funding. They mourned my father just long enough to open 47 bank accounts under my name. They laundered money, exploited me, and said I was ungrateful. I didn't sue them. I took the money and disappeared. Now my name isn't anyone's backup account anymore. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next shocking story we bring to light. Before I uncovered the truth, I believed helping my family was the noblest thing I'd ever done. It started with a vibration, not the loud, urgent kind that makes you think someone's calling in the middle of the night because someone's died. No, this one was quiet, low. It slipped beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the distant thrum of rain on the balcony. Marin's eyes opened in the dark just barely. Her body knew the hour before her brain did. She blinked once, twice. The room remained blurred in shades of navy and shadow. A subtle glow from her nightstand screen lit up the corner of the room like a silent lighthouse. She reached for the phone automatically, hand-brushing the cold surface of her nightstand before finding it. She didn't check the time. She already knew it was too early for anything good. One line on the lock screen. Alert. Incoming deposit of $12,000 account ending in 0279. Marin sat up. Not because the number was large. She'd seen larger, approved larger, moved larger often on behalf of others. But the account number 0279 made her stomach twist in a way she hadn't felt in years. That wasn't her account. Not one she remembered opening anyway. She swiped open the notification with a precision that came from a decade of financial management. Her fingers knew the sequence. Her heart didn't. The banking app loaded slowly, or maybe her breath just stopped long enough to stretch time thin. The screen glowed white, almost blinding in the pitch of 2:13 a.m. There it was. Account holder, Marin D. Shipley, status active. Joint ownership. Last activity incoming deposit $12,000. Origin Shipley Nail Bar, Houston TX. Her brother's business. Her name, $12,000. No explanation. No consent. She scrolled quickly, adrenaline sharpening her pupils as transaction histories populated. This account hadn't just appeared tonight. It had been in use, actively, quietly. Withdrawals, vendor payments, recurring deposits every 2 weeks. Payroll. The name listed beneath the EIN was hers. She let out a breath, sharp-clipped too fast. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. She clicked the account settings. Joint holder Jaden Shipley, authorized since March 14, 2017. Her birthday. Her hands started to tremble, not from fear, not yet, but from the sheer impossibility of the math. She backed out of the account, opened the Accounts tab, and stared. 47 active financial instruments, all listed under her name. Some with joint owners, some with vague labels like Emergency Family Fund or Medical Reserve or simply Household 2. Household 2. Her breath hitched. The kind of hitch that makes you feel like your own chest just betrayed you. She tapped into one randomly. Household 2 had been used 3 times last month. Utility payments, rent. An Instacart order to an address she recognized instantly, her mother's second condo, the one no one ever mentioned anymore, the one for retirement. She closed the app, threw the phone onto the bed beside her, and leaned forward, head in her hands. The room was suddenly too quiet. She could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock across the apartment, hear the soft shifting of the building's plumbing in the walls, hear her own heartbeat pulsing in her ears. She reached for the nightstand drawer. The motion was familiar, habitual, almost ritualistic. But this time it wasn't to pull out a book or a charger. She slid open the bottom compartment and took out a leather-bound folder. The kind you buy when you think you'll be the one keeping everyone else organized. When you still believe that doing things right will protect you from being used. Inside files, neatly labeled, Legal documents, password backups, letters she'd never sent. Her father's death certificate. She flipped to the back. Tucked into the final sleeve was a sheet of paper she hadn't looked at in years. A power of attorney document. Old, slightly yellowed at the edges, her name, Jaden's name, her father's signature at the bottom. She remembered that day like it was pressed into her bones. He'd had surgery scheduled the next morning. He was afraid. Jaden had cried. Her father had said, "Just in case something happens, sweetheart, you're the only one I trust." The irony scorched. The document gave Jaden shared access to one of her accounts for medical transfers only. Nothing about business, nothing about real estate, nothing about payroll. But that didn't stop them, did it? She grabbed her phone again, thumb flying. She pulled up her secure vault. One by one, she typed the last 4 digits of every account she didn't recognize, cross-checked addresses, transaction histories, and with each confirmation, her stomach hollowed further. Medical reimbursements to hospitals in cities she hadn't visited, a car note for a vehicle she'd never seen, pet insurance for a dog she didn't know existed. Some accounts had been opened as recently as 8 months ago. Others had existed for nearly a decade. She sat in the middle of her bed, surrounded by digital fingerprints and paper betrayals. The city outside remained asleep. A siren in the distance wailed like a warning she hadn't heard soon enough. But this wasn't new. No, this had been built slowly, like rot in a foundation, invisible until the floor gives out from under you. She leaned back, letting the folder rest in her lap, her hand gripping the page with the POA like it might leap up and defend itself. Her father had loved her, she knew that, but love hadn't protected her. Trust hadn't protected her. And the silence, the years of silence she had cultivated like a practice, had not only failed to shield her, it had become their permission slip. Marin stood up the cold from the floor, biting into her heels as she crossed the apartment. She didn't bother turning on the lights. The refrigerator's hum, the rain's rhythm, the glow from her screen. That was enough. She poured water into the kettle and set it to boil. She needed tea, not because it would fix anything, but because it was the only thing in this moment she still had control over. Steam hissed softly. She stared at the window above her sink. The city didn't care, but the city also didn't take from her. She picked up her phone once more, returned to the first account, Shipley Nail Bar, the one Jaden owned. She clicked on the EIN registration. Taxpayer Marin D. Shipley. Business manager Jaden T. Shipley. Legal co-signer Dolores A. Shipley. Loan collateral Marin's credit file. The ground beneath her didn't crack. She did not fall to her knees. She did not scream. She simply lowered the phone slowly and whispered, "You really did it." The steam from the kettle rose behind her. She didn't turn it off. She didn't move, not for a long moment, because something old inside her had just snapped. And it wasn't rage. It wasn't even sorrow. It was recognition. They hadn't just used her. They had built a life using her. A system, a structure, a web. They'd authored entire chapters of their survival under her name, her credit, her silence. And they'd done it so quietly she never even heard them typing. Until now. The kettle whistled. She turned it off without looking. And in the stillness that followed, a new thought came, clearer than anything she'd felt in years. I am not their safety net. She poured water into a cup. No sugar, no honey, just bitter black tea. She carried it back to the desk, slid the folder open again, and laid out the documents side by side. The banking app stayed open beside them, a quiet witness to her awakening. The clock ticked 2:56 a.m. By the time the sun rose, she knew she would never be the same. The past has a strange way of showing up uninvited, especially when you think you've buried it under folders, contracts, and the kind of silence that only comes from exhaustion. It was still dark when Marin sat down at her dining table, tea in hand, her screen still open to the account she'd discovered hours earlier. Her body felt hollow, like she'd been drained and replaced with static. She thought she'd cry. She didn't. Instead, she opened a folder on her desktop labeled Personal Archive and clicked into a subfolder marked 2014. And there it was, the scanned contract of sale for her shares in Bright Ridge Financial, the company she'd helped build from the ground up in her 20s. She had sold every last bit of it. For Dolores, it had been spring. Her father's heart attack had caught them all off guard. A 72-hour whirlwind of ambulance rides, ICU machines, insurance paperwork, and a waiting room where no one slept and no one spoke unless absolutely necessary. Marin remembered standing outside the ICU window watching her father sleep beneath a web of tubes, and Dolores gripping her wrist so tightly it left marks. "He can't die in a public hospital," Dolores had whispered, voice ragged with grief or pride. It was always hard to tell which. So Marin made a call, then another. By sundown the next day, she had signed away her equity, 5 years of sweat, risk, and sacrifice in exchange for enough liquidity to transfer her father to a private facility with a view of the ocean and a nurse named Simone, who braided his hair when he was too weak to lift a hand. He died 12 days later, and the bill didn't. Dolores had wept at the funeral. Jaden had held her like she was made of glass. Marin had stood a few feet back, quietly footing the costs of cremation floral arrangements and a guest book no one signed. It didn't feel like a choice back then. It felt like responsibility. Afterward, Dolores had refused to sell the house. "Your father wanted Jaden to have stability," she'd said. "You have your job. This is the least we can do." So Marin did more. She bought Jaden a condo. Not in his name, he was still trying to get his credit fixed. Something about a bad run-in with a failed clothing line. So she put it in hers. Just until he got back on his feet. She remembered the way he hugged her that day. Half-hearted, one-armed, already distracted by a notification on his phone. "I'll pay you back." With interest, he'd mumbled, but he never did, and she never asked. Until once. It was 2 years ago. Summer. The condo needed new plumbing and Jaden had called panicked because his savings were tied up in crypto. Marin had wired the funds immediately, then later that night sent a gentle message. "Hey, I know things have been tight, but maybe we could revisit how to handle the property stuff together. I don't mind helping, but I just want us all to be clear, moving forward." The response came 2 minutes later. A voice memo. He hadn't even bothered to type. "You know what, I'm so tired of you bringing this up like you're some damn martyr. You act like we're leeches. But maybe if you weren't so obsessed with control, you wouldn't feel so used. No one asked you to do all that, Marin. You did it 'cause you wanted to. Don't rewrite history." She remembered sitting on her couch frozen. Not because it hurt, but because she realized in that moment he truly believed that. She had closed her phone and gone to bed that night with a heaviness she couldn't name. She could now. Entitlement. And beneath it, betrayal. She stared at the contract on her screen, then minimized it and opened her email. Her inbox had grown since dawn. Work updates, promo codes, a notice from her health provider. Then tucked between the mundane, subject urgent notice, name flagged in IRS investigation. Her pulse slowed, not sped up oddly enough. She clicked. It was from a case analyst named Tessa Sanborn, referencing an open inquiry tied to a possible financial shell network involving 3 EINs registered to a Marin Shipley across multiple states. The note requested confirmation of her authorization for businesses operating under names she didn't recognize. Shipley & Co. Logistics, Shipley Wellness Retreats, and one she did recognize, Shipley Nail Bar. Her tea went cold. She read the email again, then again. Each time the air seemed thinner. Her name was being used to float ventures she had no part in, ventures now being probed for tax evasion and potential laundering. Her identity wasn't just borrowed. It was duplicated, fragmented, weaponized. And she had let it happen, not by negligence, by love. By blindfolded loyalty, by years of being told it's just temporary or you're the smart one, you'll figure it out. Every time she made peace with another financial concession, she'd told herself she was being generous, that it would come back in trust, in love, in appreciation. It never did, and the tax audit was the proof. She leaned back, her chair creaking beneath her, and looked around her apartment. Nothing about this space said victim. No chaos, no clutter, no signs of a life unraveling. Just her. Just the quiet. But something in her had ruptured. That night when the account showed the deposit, when the names started appearing, and now this, the IRS alert, it wasn't a spark anymore. It was a bonfire. Marin stood up. She didn't even realize she was moving until she found herself at the mirror in the hallway. Her reflection looked tired. Not broken, not frantic, just someone who'd carried too much weight without complaint and was finally feeling the tremor in her spine. The kind that comes right before a structure collapses. But she wasn't going to collapse. Not this time. She went back to her laptop and opened a blank document. At the top she typed, "They called it help. I called it debt." Below she began listing every instance she could remember. $43,000 father's medical bills, $18,750 condo deposit for Jaden, $12,900 repairs plus property tax year 1, $5,000 loan repayment for Dolores's dental work, $3,200 bail money. Jaden, 2019. Each line felt like peeling off a scab, and beneath every scab was not healing but rot. She scrolled back to the IRS email and replied with a brief, factual response. "I did not authorize these entities. Please advise on next steps to protect my identity." Then she clicked send. She sat there for a moment, her hand hovering over her phone. It buzzed. A new message. "Jaden, sis saw some weird activity on the business account. Did you touch something?" "Just LMK. All good." All good. She stared at the message, rereading it for the tonal arrogance disguised as nonchalance. There was no apology. No question about whether she was okay. Just concern that the gravy train might be changing tracks. She didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, she opened the Notes app and began typing something she never thought she'd allow herself to say out loud. "I'm done being the backup plan." Because no one had checked if she was burning out. No one had asked if she was scared. They only noticed when she stopped giving. And now, she was going to stop. Not with rage, but with a precision they wouldn't see coming. She wasn't planning revenge. She was writing an audit. And the first entry, $12,000 deposited at 2:08 a.m. Unnamed debt. No more. It was 7:44 a.m. when Marin reopened the spreadsheet. She hadn't slept. Not really. Her body had rested stiffly upright in the chair, but her mind had run laps chasing numbers like they might lead her somewhere safe. They didn't. They led her back to where it all began. She titled the sheet Transfers. 2013 to 2023. It was plain, unemotional, the way accountants learn to bury the personal beneath the formula. Column A date, column B amount, column C recipient, column D purpose, column E notes. The first line took longer than it should have. March 22nd, 2013, $43,000, Houston, private medical center. Dad's heart surgery. Notes funds wired from Bright Ridge payout, immediate transfer post-equity sale. The cursor blinked at her. Accusatory, impatient. She kept going. Tuition reimbursements. Credit card balances. Groceries delivered to an address that wasn't hers. Rent paid for an apartment Jaden swore he only needed just until the music stuff takes off. Each entry scraped a layer off her chest. Some of them she remembered painfully clear: the calls in the middle of the night, the panicked voicemails, the "I don't know who else to call." Others were fuzzier, lost to the blur of giving so often and so quickly that it became involuntary. What began as generosity had become reflex, and reflex had become obligation. By the time she reached line 68, her jaw ached from clenching. She hadn't even realized her hand was trembling until the cursor jumped rows from the pressure of her finger. She paused to breathe. Then she scrolled back up. There, between two utility payments, was a charge she didn't recognize. It wasn't large, just under $500, but the description made her blood run cold. Donation fund for fatherless families. Her eyes narrowed. That name. She clicked the hyperlink embedded in the vendor field. The page that loaded was a soft, pastel-colored website. Stock images of children smiling in unison. A mission statement typed in cursive, helping families rebuild after the loss of a provider. Marin leaned in. Then she saw it. The featured story. A picture of Dolores and Jaden standing outside a modest 2-story home with a caption beneath. After losing their primary provider unexpectedly, the Shipley family found hope through our scholarship and housing relief programs. She didn't breathe. Dolores was smiling. Jaden's arm slung casually over her shoulder, and in bold beneath them, widowed mother and son rebuild life after tragedy. Marin blinked. Once, twice. There was no mention of her. No note that she'd bought the house they were standing in front of. No context that the primary provider had not only been her father, but also her benefactor. That she, Marin, had sold her legacy to give them that roof. Nope. Just a narrative of loss and resilience they apparently curated to cash in on sympathy. She scrolled down. A list of donors. She spotted her name there too. Not as family, not even as a contributor with context. Just a bullet point beneath corporate sponsors MD Shipley. Recurring donor since 2017. Her laptop shook as she closed the tab. She stood stepping back like the screen had slapped her. Then she reached for her phone. Dolores answered on the second ring. Marin, everything okay? Marin didn't respond right away. She swallowed. Her throat felt raw, like the words themselves had to claw their way out. I saw the foundation, she said finally. A beat of silence. Then what foundation? The Fund for Fatherless Families, Marin clarified, voice clipped. Oh, that Dolores replied, dragging the word like it was inconvenient. Honey, that was years ago. They helped us when things were hard. You were never widowed, Marin said, her voice rising despite herself. You had me. I paid for everything. A pause, then a chuckle. Soft, pitying. Oh, Marin, Dolores sighed. You never used that money for yourself anyway. The words landed like a slap. You really believe that justifies this? Marin asked, her voice tighter now, sharper. I believe you care more about numbers than people. No, Marin snapped. I care that you used my father's death like a discount code. There it was. The truth, sharp and irreversible. Dolores went quiet. Then with an edge, we did what we had to. Jaden was still grieving, and you were always so busy. Busy cleaning up your lies, Marin hissed. Marin. But Marin had already hung up. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was recoil. Like the moment after a car crash when your brain catches up to what your body already knows, something is broken. She paced her apartment the same 12 steps between the kitchen island and the hallway mirror. Over and over again. They weren't even trying to deny it anymore. They'd built an entire fiction, and she had footed the bill. Not just financially, but emotionally. Her name wasn't just absent from the narrative. It had been erased, rewritten. Like she was a side character in a story that demanded a more tragic lead. She stopped pacing. She walked back to the spreadsheet, scrolled to the bottom, typed a new line. July 19th, 2017, $497.60. Fund for Fatherless Families. Donation initiated by Jaden using linked card. Notes submitted under narrative that father died leaving no financial support. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then she added one more column. Impact emotional theft. She stared at the line. The most accurate entry on the sheet so far. She sat back down, suddenly exhausted in a way that T couldn't fix. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine something different. What if instead of quietly patching the holes in everyone else's boat, she built something of her own? What if her story didn't end in quiet acceptance? What if she stopped letting them write it all together? The cursor blinked, waiting. So was she, but not anymore. It was 10:06 a.m. when the call came through. Marin was sitting at her desk scrolling through receipts when the screen lit up unknown number, TX Region Banking Office. She stared at it for a full 3 rings, her thumb hovering. Her first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something in her stomach, something cold and exacting, told her to answer. She did. Hello, is this Ms. Marin Shipley? Yes, this is Jonah Dean from Trustline Bank's Legal Advisory Division. We're following up on an internal inquiry triggered by a pattern of transactions on a jointly held account under your name. Do you have a few moments to speak? Her spine straightened. I do. Great, I'll be brief. He spoke like someone who had done this many times before, calm, unhurried, but firm. The kind of voice that didn't raise alarms unless it absolutely had to. Records indicate that a Mr. Jaden Shipley has been operating under the authority granted by a power of attorney filed in 2015. Can you confirm the legitimacy of that document on your behalf? Marin didn't answer right away. Her eyes had drifted to her bookshelf. Second shelf far left, a thin navy folder wedged between an old accounting textbook and a framed photo of her father. Yes, she said finally. I signed something in 2015, but I need you to tell me what it's being used for. There was a pause. Then Jonah's voice returned slower this time. From what we can see, Mr. Shipley has used that authority to initiate new financial accounts, move funds between commercial and personal holdings, and apply for credit-based funding on behalf of business entities listed under your name. How many entities? 5. Marin closed her eyes. He continued. There's also a revolving credit line approved in 2018 under a shared signature, and at least 3 accounts have been used to fund non-tax reported business expenses, including hospitality and service vendor contracts. Every syllable landed like a stone in her throat. Have any of those accounts been flagged externally? She asked, voice steady despite the pulse she could feel pressing against her temple. Yes, Jonah said. One was referenced in a recent IRS inquiry. I believe you've been contacted about it. I have. Another pause. We're legally required to inform you that continued use of the power of attorney, if revoked or disputed, must be updated through formal documentation. Would you like me to initiate that process? Yes. Her voice didn't waver. I want every account frozen immediately, every shared access terminated, and I want the original POA reviewed for misuse. There was a pause long enough to feel like agreement. I can initiate all of that today, Jonah said. You'll receive a packet via encrypted email within the hour. Thank you. One more thing, he added. You're not the first. She blinked. Excuse me, you're not the first person to have this happen, he said. Family signatures, quiet permissions, power of attorneys that were never meant for what they became. We see it more than you'd think, but it doesn't make it right. No, it didn't. She hung up, gently, not because she was calm, but because something had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise but moves mountains anyway. She stood and walked over to the bookshelf, pulled the navy folder out. There it was. A single-page power of attorney, folded in thirds. No notarization, no witness, just 2 signatures. Hers and Jaden's. She remembered that day. The late afternoon sun slanting through her father's bedroom blinds. Dolores pacing in the hallway. Jaden sitting on the edge of the bed flipping the pen between his fingers like it meant nothing. Her father had been tired, faint. I just want to make sure things don't fall apart if something happens, he had said. I'm already handling everything, Marin had replied. I know, he'd smiled. That's why I trust you, but Jaden's younger. He needs to learn. You want me to give him legal access to my account so he can learn? It's just a piece of paper, he said. He won't use it unless he has to. But he had. And not because he had to. Because he could. Because she had made it easy. Because love had always meant making room for everyone else, even when it crowded her out of her own life. She pressed the folder closed, then walked it to the kitchen and placed it calmly into the shredder she'd bought last tax season. The machine whirred to life, teeth chewing through years of misplaced loyalty. The sound was soft, almost pleasant. It was 10:42 a.m. when she logged into her financial dashboard. Passwords accepted. 2-factor authentication confirmed. She clicked the Account Settings tab, then Manage Access. The names appeared like ghosts. Jaden, Dolores, Clarissa, each tied to something, an email address, a backup login, a permission line quietly granted when someone had called, crying or frantic or just this once. She hovered over Jaden first. Clicked Remove Access. The site prompted her to confirm, "Are you sure you want to revoke shared access for this user?" She didn't hesitate. Yes. One by one, she moved through the list. Clarissa's access to her Amazon account gone. Dolores's utility payment draft disabled. Jaden's fingerprint authorization on a joint checking app revoked. Each click felt like undoing stitches someone else had sewn into her skin. She didn't cry, didn't flinch. This wasn't grief. It was extraction. At 11:07 a.m., she reached the final tab passwords. She clicked Generate New. Her fingers typed quickly, muscle memory guiding her through combinations of numbers, letters, characters. Not just security, but reclamation. When the final password was saved, she sat back. The dashboard shimmered. Clean. Silent. Like a house after the last guest leaves and you realize they weren't guests at all. They'd been squatters. Quietly moving things around, leaving crumbs erasing your photos from the wall. She walked into the hallway mirror again. This time the woman staring back at her looked different. Not because her face had changed, but because the fog had lifted. She wasn't confused anymore. They had made her the accountant of their dysfunction. And now, she was closing the books. No warning, no text, no apology. Just a full system reset. It was 6:18 p.m. when Marin's phone buzzed. Not a call, a message. From Jaden. Netflix is not working, did you reset something? That was it. No greeting. No question about how she was. No acknowledgement of the storm she knew deep down he felt brewing beneath their feet. Just a passive-aggressive emoji and a broken stream. She stared at the message for a full minute. Her thumb hovered over it like it might catch fire. And then she laughed, quietly. The kind of laugh that doesn't come from joy, but from the clarity of finally seeing someone for exactly who they are. He hadn't even asked. Not why, not if, not are you okay. Just did you break my convenience? No thank you for 10 years of subsidized services. No remorse, no confusion, just inconvenience disguised as entitlement. She didn't respond. She powered off the screen and leaned back in her chair. The room around her was still. The kind of stillness that feels earned. Not empty, not lonely, just uncluttered. She stood and walked to her cabinet. Pulled out a small box labeled Events, 2021. She'd been meaning to go through it for months. Inside were envelopes, invitations, receipts, a folder with a small sticker that read, Clarissa's 50th. She opened it. Inside a neatly printed invoice for catering, balloons, a custom cake with edible gold foil. Her credit card had been used. She remembered paying that one off in January, assuming Clarissa had meant to Venmo her and forgot. Of course, Clarissa had forgotten. They all did. She ran her fingers over the receipt, then closed the folder and picked up a different one. This one labeled Natalie, 7th B-Day, a niece, a party, a giant bouncy castle. She'd funded it start to finish. Clarissa had called her 2 days before, frantic, saying the vendor had doubled the price. And it's just one birthday, Marin, please. She'd paid it. No one told her the party had moved to another venue. No one mentioned the change. She found out later through someone else's Facebook post. In the photo, the whole family stood behind the cake. Marin wasn't in it. She hadn't even been invited. She had called once asking if they'd meant to include her. Clarissa's voice had been light, almost condescending. Oh, honey, Natalie's just a kid. You know how kids are. She doesn't even really know you. Didn't seem like you'd care to come. You told her I wasn't free. Well, weren't you? No apology? Just the casual rewriting of the story. Like Marin had opted out. Like her absence was a choice, not an erasure. She sat back down at her desk and opened her email. There it was. Fresh, new, subject line. Thank you to the Shipley family. Community Builders of the Month. The Sender family's Forward Foundation, a nonprofit she had donated to for years. Her name wasn't mentioned once. The letter thanked the Shipley family for their contributions, for sponsoring the new reading room, for their decade of generosity. There was even a quote from Jaden. Giving back is what Dad would have wanted. We were raised to care. Marin clicked on the attachment. It was a newsletter. There they were again. A photo. Jaden. Clarissa. Dolores. all three standing beside a plaque on a bench that read, "Dedicated by the Shipley family in loving memory of Thomas Shipley." Her father, her funds, their names. Not a single mention of Marin, not even as a donor. She closed the laptop softly, stood, walked to the kitchen, made tea without thinking. The routine steadied her. Boil, steep, pour. She sipped it slowly, letting the heat anchor her. It wasn't about credit. Not really. It was about being erased from a story she wrote in full. Every dollar, every document, every desperate midnight call answered. She had carried them quietly endlessly. And now, when the weight became too inconvenient to hold anymore, they didn't drop her. They deleted her and wrote themselves as the saviors. She took her tea and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to drop behind the skyline, the kind of twilight that turns windows into mirrors. She saw her own reflection, small still but solid, and she whispered without drama or tears, "They never saw me. Not as a sister, not as a daughter, not even as a person. Just as a solution, a fix, a balance to borrow against." She turned from the window, set down the tea, and sat back at her laptop. Then methodically she logged into every platform she could think of. Utilities, streaming services, auto-pay dashboards, joint plans, subscription bundles. Her fingers typed without hesitation. Clarissa's name removed. Dolores removed. Jaden removed. One by one each tether was severed. She didn't send warnings, no emails, no "hey, just FYI," because they didn't deserve that. Because they hadn't asked permission when they added themselves in the first place. Why give courtesy to people who never offered it in return? She opened Spotify. 3 devices were listed under her family plan. Jaden's phone, Dolores's Echo, Clarissa's tablet. Gone. She opened Hulu. 6 profiles. She only used 1. The rest were theirs. Gone. She reached the final login Prime Video. Clarissa had used it last night. She'd left a review for some reality show. 5 stars. Love this, thanks fam. Delete. Done. Her phone buzzed again. Jaden, Netflix still won't work. You changed the password or something. She didn't respond. Didn't even open the message. She just stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then she whispered to herself, "You don't get to ask for access when you never gave me belonging." This wasn't revenge. This was rebalancing. And this time, she wasn't leaving room for interpretation. She wasn't the problem solver. She wasn't the afterthought. She wasn't their silent ATM with a heart. She was Marin, and they never really knew what that meant. Now they would. It started with a whisper, not from anyone else, but from inside her. That quiet, deliberate voice she hadn't heard in years. The one that didn't beg or explain. The one that knew when enough was enough. Marin sat at her desk, a second cup of black tea going cold beside her, the cursor blinking on an empty screen like a loaded weapon with the safety off. The tab was open. One of the 5 ghost funds she'd found, accounts created in her name, but operated under someone else's ambition. Each had the same pattern. Her SSN, her credit backing her digital signature, lifted probably from a decade-old tax form or shared Google Drive. The front-facing names were shiny and generic. Elevate Her Mentorship Collective. Fund for Fatherless Families. New Roots Mental Health Relief. All emotional bait, all tax-exempt, all funded by money they said they didn't have. Marin's hand moved slowly, precisely. She was inside now, authorized by design, but now acting with full awareness. The interface asked for confirmation before editing beneficiary disbursements. She bypassed it using the same credentials Jaden used to apply for his SBA loan under her name. How did she know? Because she'd sat through a full 28 minutes of his voice in a recorded funding webinar posted on the organization's website where he explained proudly how they'd built a financial model based on community legacy. Community in their language meant her. Legacy meant leverage. Her leverage. At $35.19, she clicked transfer. The amount blinked back at her, $108, $423.82, accumulated over 4 years, siphoned slowly like a patient thief who believes time erases guilt. But not today. She typed in the routing number of a foundation she had quietly set up 3 weeks prior after the first red flag from the IRS came through. It had no public board members, no family affiliations, and no social media. It was a true nonprofit registered under an anonymous LLC held through a Delaware trust. Its only mission to fund post-secondary education for orphans with no extended family support. True Orphans. She had named it after the man who died quietly in his sleep with unpaid hospital bills and a family that forgot his name the minute they cashed his life. The Thomas Shipley Trust. She didn't cry when she typed the description of the transfer recovered funds, unauthorized use, reallocated for ethical purpose. The confirmation screen blinked. Are you sure you want to transfer all funds? This action cannot be undone. She clicked yes. No hesitation. No second thoughts. There was power in not asking anymore. There was dignity in not negotiating with those who made her invisible. The next fund was smaller, just over $30,000, but it had Jaden's fingerprints all over it. She recognized the vendor names, printing companies that had made pamphlets for his community, healing events, restaurants that had catered his donor brunches, photographers who captured him, mid-speech sleeves rolled up, smiling like salvation. She withdrew it all. Same process, same silent, precise execution. By 3642, she had completed transfers from all 5 entities. The total sum just under $300,000. It wasn't about the number. It was about the narrative. She was not erasing what they had done. She was reclaiming what they stole and giving it to someone who would never get a text from a brother saying, "Did you reset the Netflix?" She exhaled long and slow as the final screen flashed transfer complete. Reference ID 8X2LQ9FG17. For the first time in weeks, her hands didn't shake. She opened a new tab, drafted an email. No pleasantries, no apologies, just one sentence. Subject: no refunds. Body: don't worry. The money you stole was donated to a more honest cause. The children it helps will never know my name. Just as you never truly did, M. She sent it to a private thread that included Jaden, Dolores, and Clarissa. Not BCC, not hidden. Direct, unflinching. She closed the laptop. Silence filled the apartment like steam from a kettle. Warm at first, then sharp. She waited. She didn't have to wait long. At 41:12, her phone lit up. Jaden calling. The screen flashed once, then again, and again. 6 calls in 2 minutes. He never left a voicemail, just kept calling, as if sheer repetition could summon her back to the role she'd finally abandoned. She didn't answer, not because she was angry, but because she finally understood he wasn't calling out of remorse. He was calling out of panic, because the faucet had been shut off, because the oxygen was no longer free. She walked to the kitchen, made another cup of tea, this one with a little honey. The sweetness was jarring, unexpected. She sipped it slowly. Jaden's name lit up her screen again. This time she turned the phone face down, walked to the balcony. The wind was cold against her skin, but not colder than what she had lived through, not colder than being forgotten at her own father's memorial, not colder than buying someone a future and not being invited to the ribbon cutting. Out here there was no noise, no text threads, no gaslighting, just air and the quiet power of having finally acted. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt clean, like she had just walked out of a house that had been on fire for 10 years and hadn't realized she'd been breathing smoke until she stepped into air that didn't choke her. Behind her, her phone buzzed again. She didn't turn back. Let it ring. Let them panic. Let them squirm. Let them finally taste the vacuum they had left her in all those years. And when the teacup was empty, she whispered, "To my father, I finally kept a promise. Just not the one they wanted." It didn't take long. By the next morning, the cracks had begun to split open. Not quietly, not gradually, but violently, like a dam giving out under a pressure no one thought was real. At 8:03 a.m., Marin's phone buzzed with a news alert. Local nail salon under federal investigation for tax misuse. Owner declines to comment. She didn't have to read the rest. She recognized the storefront in the thumbnail, the white and pink awning, the cursive lettering Jaden paid $600 for, the same place that had hosted his community therapy sessions on Sundays when they didn't feel like paying rent for event space. She opened the article anyway. Jaden's name was in the second paragraph, the word fraud in the third. By 8:20 a.m., the salon's Yelp page had been updated with one-star reviews, some from people who'd never been, others from former clients who'd seen the whispers circling on Instagram. By 9:00 a.m., the place was closed. Closed for remodeling. The sign read, taped hastily onto the glass door with uneven Scotch tape. But Marin knew better. So did the IRS. At 9:47 a.m., her mother Dolores posted to Facebook. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. She'd gone straight to the crowd. Her post was long, dramatic, and predictably self-centered. I never thought I'd be betrayed by my own daughter. But here we are. Sometimes family turns on you when you need them most. Sometimes they take everything you built with love and throw it away for pride. I'm praying for peace, for everyone. The comments rolled in instantly. Stay strong, Dolores. Family can be the cruelest. I'm so sorry. She'll come around once she realizes what she's done. Marin didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Because nothing in that post was a surprise. It was the same performance, just repackaged for a digital audience. The same tears Dolores used when the furnace broke. The same victimhood she wore like perfume. At 10:12 a.m., the text started. Not from Dolores, not from Jaden. From people who weren't supposed to be watching. Old coworkers, neighbors, distant cousins. Hey, I don't want to assume anything, but is the stuff online true? Are you okay? Are you taking legal action? One of them included a screenshot of Dolores's post captioned with a single question. Are you really suing your own family? Marin stared at the screen. No part of her felt like explaining, because explaining meant justifying. And justifying meant giving space to people who had already decided she was the villain in a story they authored. She closed the message, silenced her phone, and opened her laptop instead. There was a new file on her desktop, unnamed. She hadn't put it there. For a split second, her breath caught. Then she double-clicked. The file opened. An audio file, grainy, lo-fi. Probably recorded on a phone hidden in someone's jacket pocket. She clicked play. The voices were unmistakable. Jaden, Dolores, Clarissa, laughing, talking over each other like they always did, excited, entitled, rehearsed. The key is keeping her busy, Jaden said casually. As long as she's working, she doesn't look up, Dolores added. And even if she does, she won't say anything. She never does. Then Clarissa, with a sigh and a smirk audible in her tone, she just wants to feel useful. Let her pay for things. She thinks it makes her needed. Marin's face remained still. Her heart didn't. She listened again, this time catching the end of the recording. Jaden again, this time quieter. It's not like we're stealing. It's all in the family. There it was. The permission they gave themselves. The justification carved into entitlement. She closed the file, renamed it, Proof, No More Denial, then dragged it into the folder she'd labeled weeks ago legal, in case they lie. Because she knew they would. They already had. And now she didn't need their admissions. She had their voices. She stood from the desk and walked to the kitchen, made herself coffee, not because she needed caffeine, but because she needed to feel her hands doing something steady, something normal, something unshaken. As the machine hummed, her phone buzzed on the counter. Jaden again, this time not calling, texting. Whatever you think you did, you're making it worse. You need to talk to us before this spirals. Before this spirals, she let out a breath that was half laugh, half growl. This had spiraled. She hadn't caused it. She'd uncovered it. There's a difference between starting a fire and revealing where it's already been burning. She took a sip from her mug, stared out the window, and let the world burn exactly as it needed to. It was raining the day Vernon showed up. Not the kind of dramatic thunderclap storm you'd see in a movie. This was quieter. A gray, persistent drizzle that coated the sidewalks and smeared the skyline into watercolor. Marin had just finished her tea when the intercom buzzed. She hadn't ordered anything. She wasn't expecting anyone, but the voice that came through was low, clipped, unmistakably familiar. "It's Vernon, we need to talk." She stared at the speaker like it had cursed at her. Vernon hadn't called in over a year, hadn't sent a message when her father died, hadn't said a word while the world she built for their family unraveled in the spotlight. Now here he was, outside her building in the rain, holding a manila folder like it was a flag of surrender. She didn't press the buzzer. She didn't need to. By the time she opened the door to the apartment hallway, he was already standing there. Damp blazer, wrinkled collar, eyes that didn't look tired, just annoyed, like she was an obligation he couldn't skip anymore. "Marin," he nodded. "Vernon," she said calmly. He lifted the folder, shook it slightly. "This is a counterclaim." Of course it was. He walked past her without being invited in. The old habit unbroken. But this time she didn't step aside. He froze halfway through the threshold. "You're not the first lawyer in this family anymore," she said. His jaw tightened. She saw it. The twitch he used to get when she corrected his numbers in front of guests. He hated being reminded that she could out-logic him. "I'm not here to fight," he muttered, extending the folder like a white flag. But it wasn't. It never was. "I'm not fighting either," she replied. "I'm protecting myself." She didn't take the folder. He cleared his throat, tried to regroup. "You could have come to us. Talk to us first. All this media stuff, the legal threats, do you know how this looks?" She smiled, but there was nothing soft in it. "I do," she said. "It looks like someone finally turned the lights on." He tried again, this time leaning into familiarity. "Marin, we're family." "No," she cut in. "You're the man who coached my brother to forge my name on business documents, who helped Dolores set up a donation scam using my dead father's image. You're not family. You're a strategist." The silence between them went taut. Then Vernon exhaled through his nose like a man trying not to snap. He lowered the folder to his side. "I don't know what you think you're going to get out of all this," he said finally. Marin stepped forward. "I'm not trying to get anything," she said, her voice low firm. "I'm trying to take back what's mine. My identity, my credit, my voice." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time she saw it. Not guilt, not anger, fear, because she wasn't bluffing, because the woman standing in front of him wasn't the girl he once told to tone it down at dinner parties. This woman didn't need permission. She didn't need approval. She needed air, and she was finally breathing. He left without saying goodbye. Just turned and walked down the hall, the folder still in his hand, the rain still tapping against the windows like a clock running out. By the time the elevator doors closed, Marin was already back at her laptop. The headline had broken an hour ago. "Financial advisor accuses family of identity theft, fraud, and emotional exploitation." The article was clean, clinical, not salacious but factual. It detailed the joint accounts, the fraudulent business entities, the POA abuse. It included no family photos. Just a single quote from Marin's public statement, "I'm not suing my family, I'm correcting the record." And underneath that, a line from the journalist. In an era of online scams and fraud alerts, perhaps the quietest threat is the one that shares your last name. It spread quickly. By nightfall, she'd received over 70 messages, some anonymous, some supportive, some quietly relieved. Others confused, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the scandal unraveling in the press. But one message stood out. It came from a producer at a national news outlet. They wanted her story. They weren't interested in the drama. They wanted to talk about the silent epidemic of financial abuse within families. They called her a survivor of inheritance manipulation. She read that phrase twice, then 3 times. She had never put those words together before, but they were true. That's what this had been, a hijacking of legacy, a theft not just of money but of narrative. And for the first time, someone outside her world saw it, named it, asked her to speak on it. She didn't say yes right away. She didn't need a spotlight. She just needed a mirror. And now that one had finally been offered without distortion, she wasn't going to look away. She picked up her phone, called her lawyer, and simply said, "They're going to ask questions. I'm ready to answer." It started with a sentence. No disclaimers, no apologies, no softening for the comfort of others. Just this: "I am no longer anyone's secondary account." Marin typed it at 6:41 a.m., her thumb hovering for a full 10 seconds before pressing post. Attached was a long, unflinching reflection. She wrote about years of financial silence, about the burden of keeping others afloat while they sharpen knives behind her back, about the false choices dressed up as family obligation, the cost of being the quiet one, the lie of being too capable to be a victim. She ended the post with a line that stopped the scroll for thousands of strangers. Some people inherit trauma. Others inherit bills. I inherited both and paid for everyone else's. By 9:00 a.m., the post had gone viral. By noon, it had been shared across private forums for financial abuse survivors. By sundown, her inbox had more than 300 messages. But it wasn't validation she craved. It was the cleanness of the truth. And that finally was hers. At 6:12 p.m., someone knocked on her door. She expected another reporter. Instead, it was Ava, 14, wearing a raincoat 2 sizes too big, holding a small paper box and a folded napkin. "I wasn't sure if you'd answer," Ava said quietly. "I wasn't sure either," Marin replied. They sat in the living room. No grand speeches, no rehearsed forgiveness. Just 2 women, one who had been ignored, the other still young enough to know she didn't want to become what her parents were. Inside the paper box was a cupcake, vanilla, with a single candle pressed off-center. Ava lit it. They didn't sing. They just watched the flame flicker, unsure if it was celebration or mourning. After a few minutes, Ava whispered, "Mom says you're dangerous now." Marin smiled. It wasn't bitter. It was the kind that finally recognized the shape of freedom. "Good," she said. "It means I stopped being useful." They didn't talk much after that. And they didn't need to, because some silences are healing. The kind that doesn't hide pain, just lets it breathe. Later that night, Marin launched the group. She called it "The Ones Who Chose to Wake Up." But the subtitle underneath was what caught attention: support for those financially erased by their own families. Within 24 hours, over 100 applications came in. Stories from nurses, teachers, bartenders, IT specialists, people who had co-signed loans they never touched, people who discovered businesses in their name, people who were told, "You're the smart one, you'll recover." And Marin answered every message, not like a savior, but like someone who'd crawled through the same tunnel and now stood at the mouth of it, holding a light behind her. There were no therapy hashtags, no pastel graphics, just space and accountability. And one pinned post that read, "If they didn't ask permission when they borrowed your name, you don't owe them kindness when you take it back." The next morning, a letter arrived. Real paper, handwritten, ink slightly smudged in the corner like someone had cried just enough to make it honest. It was from Evelyn, the woman who helped her file the paperwork for the anonymous scholarship fund. The letter was short, but it ended with this: "I don't know if closure is real, but I know this much: he would be proud. Not because you exposed them, but because you didn't let what they did become who you are." Marin read that last sentence twice, then 3 times. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She stepped outside without her phone, walked to the end of the block, sat on a bench facing nothing in particular, and let the sun hit her face like a truth that didn't need defending anymore. There was no ceremony, no dramatic music, no trembling hands, just the slow, deliberate act of erasure. Marin sat at her desk browser, open cursor, hovering over a folder titled Family. Inside were years of photos, birthdays she paid for but wasn't in, weddings she helped finance but wasn't invited to. One by one she selected them. The image of her father's worn smile beside Jaden's graduation cap. The staged photo of the Christmas tree where Dolores had made her sit slightly off-center. The snapshot from the barbecue where everyone else toasted and Marin held the camera. She clicked delete. The screen asked, "Are you sure you want to permanently delete these items?" Her answer was quiet but certain. Yes. Next was the group chat. The one named Shipley Strong, a cruel joke, really. It hadn't been about strength. It had been about control. Conditional inclusion. Marin was always in the group but never in the loop. She exited the chat without leaving a message. Just a clean break. Not a door slammed, but a door never owed. After that, she opened a small cedar box on her bookshelf. Inside were a few personal things her father left behind: a broken wristwatch, a half-finished crossword, and a letter he once wrote her in blue ink, never sent but clearly meant to be read someday. She didn't cry. Instead, she folded it gently, placed it in a new envelope, and labeled it "Legacy, Not Debt." The next morning, she mailed the whole box to the local community museum. No explanations. No dedications. Just a note that said, "These belong to the public memory now, not the private lies." By the end of the week, she had closed every account that tethered her to the past. Unsubscribed from the family Spotify plan. Removed her name from utilities she no longer paid. Changed her emergency contact from Jaden Shipley to none. Freedom was not a parade. It was paperwork, but it was sacred. At 11:43 p.m. that Friday, she booked a plane ticket. Not to visit anyone. Not to clean up a mess. Not to be the fixer, the buffer, the emotionally responsible daughter. This trip was hers. No itinerary, no guilt. She chose a quiet town near the coast where no one knew her name. The confirmation email pinged and she didn't forward it to anyone. The silence felt like fresh air. On the eve of her departure, she stood in her kitchen holding a glass of water, staring at the dim reflection of herself in the microwave door. She didn't look different, but something was gone. Something she never consented to carry in the first place. She picked up a small notebook from the counter, one she had bought years ago but never dared to write in. It had felt too selfish, too indulgent, too unnecessary. She opened it. Blank pages greeted her like a second chance. She wrote the first line without hesitation. "For the first time, I'm living without fixing anyone else's wreckage." She paused, read it aloud, then kept writing. She wrote about boundaries not as walls, but as doors with locks she now owned the keys to. She wrote about the lies people tell when they say, "blood is thicker," when what they mean is silence is easier. She wrote about the kind of loneliness that isn't empty but finally peaceful. And as she closed the notebook, she realized this was the beginning. Not of revenge, not of escape, but of authorship, of a story that would no longer be written by theft or guilt or obligation. This one was hers. And this time, she wouldn't sign it in someone else's ink. The subject line read, "Can you help me?" Jaden's name blinked across the top of her inbox at 7:02 a.m., right between a newsletter from the local art gallery and a spam offer for vitamin supplements. It had been weeks since she heard from him. Weeks since she'd disappeared from the map of their expectations. Weeks since she'd stepped fully into her own name. The email wasn't long. Just 6 lines. No punctuation in places where there should be. A tone that sounded rehearsed in its remorse and clumsy in its plea. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know it would go that far. I was scared. Things are a mess now. Can you help me with this situation just one last time, please? One." He ended it with a thanks. Not love, not your brother, not even Jaden. Just thanks? Marin didn't get angry. Not anymore. Anger had already served its purpose. It had excavated truth, lit the match, and burned down the illusions. Now what remained was clarity and silence. She didn't reply. She didn't forward it to anyone. She didn't screenshot it for proof. She simply dragged the email into a folder she had created for herself weeks ago. The folder was called "I Survived." She closed her laptop, and that was the end of it. No dramatic music, no triumphant montage, just quiet, honest, resolute. By 9:00 a.m., the ocean mist had begun creeping up the porch rails of her new rented cottage. It wasn't grand bare floors, chipped paint, a kettle that whistled too loudly, but it was hers. A space unsoiled by lies. A space where no one had ever called her ungrateful or too sensitive or just overthinking. She wrapped herself in an old flannel shawl and stepped outside with her coffee barefoot on the cool wooden planks. The sea breathed in and out before her, indifferent and steady. And then she smiled. It wasn't joy exactly. It was release, a slow unhooking of the guilt she never earned. The duty that had been branded into her since childhood like an invisible inheritance. She wasn't a savior. She wasn't a scapegoat. She wasn't a second chance for people who never asked for a first. She was a woman who had finally stopped bleeding herself to feed everyone else's feast. The camera fades out soft. No applause, no revenge montage. Just stillness. And then a voice. Her voice floats over the black screen like the final breath after a long, suffocating dive. You can forgive without forgetting. You can leave without avenging. And sometimes loving yourself is the loudest act of defiance. Cut to black. Then one final line appears in white, inspired by the voices that chose peace over permission.